We have several outstanding academic speakers here for us this afternoon. And before we get started, I just want to make a couple of announcements. First of all, if you're interested in more archaeology, tomorrow at the Battleground, the San Jacinto Museum of History Association is having a festival which will include a lot of events for children, but also Roger Moore and Dr. Gregg will be there and will be giving lectures from time to time throughout the day. So it'll be another opportunity for you or your families to go out to the park and get up close with the archaeology that's going on at the park. There are also many other activities that the museum is sponsoring tomorrow, and it will be followed by the annual reenactment. And as we heard, this may very well be the last full-fledged reenactment at the Battleground. So tomorrow may be your last opportunity to see that. Also, I want to mention that our authors who will be speaking, our professors who will be speaking, have books out front that you can buy, and there'll be book signing in the afternoon as well. So keep that in mind if you're interested. And with that, I'd like to turn the afternoon program over to Dr. Jim Crisp. Dr. Crisp has a degree from Rice. He's from Texas, went to Rice, and then he went on to Yale, got a PhD in history from Yale, and ended up teaching history at, of all places, North Carolina State University, where he is now an associate professor of history. He has continued his studies of Texas history and has done some outstanding research on some very difficult issues dealing with Texas history. Later this year, he'll be coming out with a book published by Oxford University Press. But last year, he agreed to serve as moderator and referee, and we've invited him back because he does such a good job. And we have a good group of speakers this year. And so without further ado, I'm going to turn this program over to Jim. And please join me in giving a warm welcome to Jim Crisp.
Thanks very much. I'll keep this short. I've been to all four of these, first as a speaker, then as a gadfly, and now as a moderator for the third and fourth ones, and I'm very honored that I was asked to come back. I'm not going to give you a great deal of biographical information or academic honors type information for our speakers, because you get that from this extraordinarily extensive documentation that you have with your program. I would like to tell you a little bit about why we chose this group and this panel. It really has as much to do with the guy coming up on stage right now as with anyone else, and that's Jack Jackson and his partner John Wheat, because as we began to look at, as I found out I was going to be moderating this fourth annual symposium, and as Jeff Dunn and Jan DeVault and all the other people involved in this and I began to talk about what might be a good program, I had just served as a reader for the Texas State Historical Association for this fantastic new book, Almonte's Texas, which Jack Jackson has just published along with John Wheat as translator. I had already read with enormous admiration the book they had done previously with the University of Texas Press, Texas by Terán, with the diary of General Manuel Mieri Terán. And Jack has just looked at one Mexican observer after another in the 1700s and the 1800s looking at Texas, and you can learn so much from these documents. And now, for the first time ever, thanks to Jack and John, we have this secret report that Almonte compiled during and after his 9-month tour of Texas in 1834. What he saw, what he recommended, and then what he helped carry out in 1836 until the plans were cut short at a place that you're fairly familiar with, San Jacinto. In any case, we thought about, as Almonte was speaking for the Mexican government and making plans for the Mexican government to a greater extent than anyone, including, I think, Santa Anna, we began to think about looking at the Texas Revolution from different perspectives, and it's the coming of the revolution. And I thought, we all thought, how appropriate then to look at it from the point of view of the Anglo settlers who had come in with Stephen Austin and others, and also from the point of view of the Tejanos, who for generations had been in Texas and often struggling for autonomy. And in thinking about the people that we ought to have speak to those issues, obviously at the top of our list were these two people, Gregg Cantrell and Andres Tijerina. That's what we asked these four gentlemen to do. Jack tells me adamantly that he does not do stand-up comedy, and so he will be throwing barbs at John while John's trying to get through his paper, and then taking part in the Q&A session and in the panel discussion afterwards.
John doesn't mind if I break in occasionally. It doesn't seem to affect his chain of thought, so I may chime in from time to time.
Yeah, that's not what John said, but I expected that you'd do it anyway. Let me just, as I introduce these people individually, I'll tell you just a little bit more about them. But in the interest of time, I'd like to start just with Gregg Cantrell. Gregg and I have been doing something for the last few months that no one else in this room, I dare say, has been doing, and that's reading copies of the newspaper from Henrietta, Texas. I'm doing it because I subscribe to it, and I try to keep up with what my homeboys are doing. Gregg is doing it because he's reading an earlier version. It's not the Clay County Leader, it's the Henrietta Independent, as Gregg tries to get a handle on what's going on with down-and-out farmers in the 1890s as he studies what will be his next project, and that is the Populist Party of Texas. Gregg is a man of many parts and knows a lot about Texas history. You can't take Bob Calvert's place with Arnoldo de Leon in that textbook without being a man of many parts and knowing a great deal about the history of our state. For me, Texas history pretty much ends in 1846. I don't have to worry about it beyond then. But he has to, as a textbook author now, he has to be much more careful and much more Catholic in his taste about Texas history. So without further ado, I'll give you the other person who's been reading these newspapers from Henrietta, and that's Gregg Cantrell. Please welcome him.
Thanks, Jim. It's a great honor to be here today. When Jim first contacted me about doing this, 6 months ago or whenever it was, I sat down and tried to think about what my approach should be to the topic of Anglo-Texans in the years leading up to San Jacinto, and what I decided not to do, and I hope people aren't too disappointed in this, I decided not to talk about the sort of textbook political and military milestones, the passage of the law of April 6, 1830, the conventions of 1832 and 33, the imprisonment of Stephen F. Austin, Santa Anna's rise to power, all of those things, because I figured this is an audience of aficionados of Texas history, and they probably know these things. What I decided to do instead was to talk more about the sort of thinking, the mindset, the mentality, the character of these Anglo-Americans who began streaming into Texas in 1821 and 22. So that's what I'm going to try to do here for a few minutes. But let me begin by, in case your memory is a little rusty from 4th and 7th grade Texas history, for those of you who hadn't had it since then, I expect there are a few, let me very briefly remind you about the basic background to the Anglo settlement of Texas. Most of you, of course, are familiar with the names of Moses and Stephen F. Austin. Moses Austin, a bankrupt lead mining baron from Missouri, with his fortune in ruins in 1820, decides to, at age 59, very old in those days, roll the dice one more time, travel to Spanish Texas, and present the local authorities in San Antonio with a rather daring plan, especially considering he didn't even have permission to be in Spanish territory. He proposed that the Spanish government grant him status as impresario, a term that that roughly translates as colonization agent. He proposed to bring 300 American families. Interestingly, the actual language of the contract that's ultimately granted called for 300 Catholic families from Louisiana, which was not exactly what ended up coming, to settle in a largely uninhabited grant of land in Texas. And as impresario, he would be in charge of recruiting colonists, settling them on the land, and acting as the liaison between the colonists and the Spanish government. As most of you know, Moses Austin dies before he can set that plan in motion. It falls to his son, Stephen F. Austin, then 26 years old, to carry out his father's grand scheme, which of course Stephen F. Austin does over the next 15 years with great dedication and ingenuity and skill. Having said that, let me just talk a little bit now about the Anglo colonists who came in to Stephen F. Austin's colony and the other colonies that were founded later. And I should point out that ultimately the state of Coahuila in Texas issues about 40 impresario contracts, the great majority of which never amount to anything, never even settle a single colonist. Stephen F. Austin's various contracts, he ultimately had 5 of them, were by far the most successful in terms of actually settling people in Texas, followed by Martin de Leon and Green DeWitt and some others who were all sort of distant seconds and thirds. So who were these people who followed Stephen F. Austin to Texas? Well, the short answer to that, I guess, is that they were good Jacksonian Democrats. Andrew Jackson is rising to the prominence in American national life at this time. Of course, he'll be president in the years shortly after Anglo colonization of Texas begins. And we all have notions about what it meant to be a Jacksonian Democrat. What did it mean? It meant that you were fiercely individualistic. You didn't like taking orders from anybody. It meant that you were a strong believer in the equality, at least the equality in the eyes of the law, of all white men. It meant that you were fiercely proud of not only of your American heritage as free men, but it also meant that you were willing to defend your honor with violence if necessary. And the kinds of Jacksonian Americans who settled Texas in many ways were the most Jacksonian of a nation of Jacksonian Democrats. Because after all, these are Jacksonian Democrats who are willing to leave their country behind, strike out into a foreign-controlled wilderness, brave the elements, take your risk with wild animals and often hostile Indians. And so these are the most individualistic, the most rough and ready of a whole society of individualistic, rough and ready Americans. And nobody learned about the essential character of these Jacksonian Americans better than Stephen F. Austin. And of course, my little confession here, of course, I'm going to use Stephen F. Austin as my lens to view these people, mainly because that's why I'm here. I wrote a book about Stephen F. Austin a number of years ago, and that's what I know the best. But also, I think the case could be made, even if that weren't the case, that Stephen F. Austin was in a unique position to know these people. He is, after all, the grand impresario of Anglo-Texas for that 15-year period. And he was a very astute observer of human nature. And all of these things, I think, and he left about 4,000 letters that we can read today in published form and mostly at the University of Texas Center for American History. So I'm going to use Stephen F. Austin as my sort of lens to try to get a finger on the pulse of these Americans who settled Texas. And Austin, in many, many letters, gave his estimation, his evaluation of the character of these people. Listen to one of his early comments about the Anglo colonists. I have had two difficult tasks to perform here. One, to manage the government, and the other to manage the settlers. Of these, the latter was by far the most difficult. I do say that the North Americans are the most obstinate and difficult people to manage that live on the earth. Austin frequently spoke of, and I'm quoting again here, the temper and dispositions of the people whom I have had to deal with. For among the ignorant part of the Americans, independence means resistance and obstinacy, right or wrong. This is particularly the case with frontiersmen, unquote. It wasn't just a matter of being stubbornly independent either. Austin discovered that these Americans brought with them an innate distrust, if not an actual disdain, for authority figures in general and political officials in particular. An element, I think, of the American character that in large part persists to this very day. For example, Austin once wrote of, quote, a principle which is common to all North Americans, a feeling which is the natural offspring of the unbridled Republican liberty enjoyed by all classes in the United States. That is, jealousy of those in office, jealousy of undue encroachments of personal rights, and a general repugnance to everything that wears even the resemblance of a stretch of power. 99 times out of 100, an officer who discharges his duty rigorously and firmly is denounced by the multitude as a tyrant. And he was in a position to know, because he was often on the receiving end of those denouncements. And this became a real problem for Austin as impresario. In 1825, Austin wrote this: one great difficulty under which I have labored is that the settlers are unacquainted with the language and nature of this government. There are no interpreters but myself and my secretary, and consequently no way for them to know the orders of the government but through one of us. This places me in a truly unpleasant situation, for you know that it is innate in an American to suspect and abuse a public officer, whether he deserves it or not. I've had a mixed multitude to deal with, collected from all quarters, strangers to each other, to me, and to the laws and language of the country. They come here with all the ideas of Americans and expect to see and understand the laws they are governed by. And many, very many of them, have all the licentiousness and wild turbulence of frontiersmen. Or one more from 1829. The truth is, the people of this colony are better off and might be happier than any other people on earth. And it is also true that they are now on the broad road to total ruin. They're destroying themselves. Most of the evils that now exist, or are supposed to exist, have their origin with the people themselves. They are too much disposed to run into extremes. At one time, withholding all confidence and suspecting or doubting everything, opening their ears to idle rumors, and at another time, showing the most perfect indifference as to who are elected to manage their affairs, or whether the laws are executed or not. Austin finally pronounced a concise verdict on the character of his colonists in 1831 when he said this: I fear, judging by my own experience, that the predominant traits in the North American character are ingratitude, selfishness, and avarice. Unquote. Which leads me to another aspect of the Anglo-American character that I think we should explore for a minute, and that is what Austin was speaking of there, avarice or greed. Now we could say, okay, there's one man's greed is another man's enlightened pursuit of self-interest, but the line could sometimes be very fine between those two things. Again, as Austin learned. The quote a minute ago when Austin spoke of the wild turbulence of these frontiersmen, let me continue that quote. Added to this, when they arrive here, the worst of the human passions, avarice, is excited to the highest extent, and it directs the vanguard in their attacks on me. Jealousy and envy direct the flanks, and maliciousness lurks in the rear to operate as occasion may require. If a person gets a league of land, he knows that he could have been granted more, and he is therefore dissatisfied, and instead of thanking me for what he gets, he abuses me for treating him unjustly because he does not get more. Austin, from time to time, entertained a very interesting solution to this problem. And here's his discussion of this solution. Quote, immigrants from Europe are not prohibited. This is after the passage of the law of April 6, which attempted to cut off immigration from the United States in 1830. Immigrants from Europe are not prohibited, and I sometimes think that Swiss and Germans will promote the prosperity of this country much more than the North Americans. They will introduce the culture of the vine, olive, etc. They are industrious and moral. They have not in general that horrible mania for speculation, which is so prominent a trait in the English and North American character, unquote. Now, lest it sound to some of you good patriotic descendants of the old 300 like I'm up here slicing and dicing Austin's character and the character of the colonists, let me say that Austin did have a lot of positive things to say about the colonists. For example, he once said this: the settlers of this colony, taken en masse, are greatly superior to any new country or frontier that I have ever seen, and would lose nothing by comparison with some of the oldest counties of many of the southern and western states. And while Austin went on to admit that some of the colonists growled, and that was his term, when he got tough with wrongdoers, he suggested that their complaints arose, quote, from a defect of judgment, not of the heart. In proportion to our numbers, we are as enlightened, as moral, as good, and as law-abiding men as can be found in any part of the United States, and greatly more so than ever settled a frontier. Indeed, I think there is as much generosity and nobleness of character as in any new country that I was ever in, unquote. In 1829, Austin elaborated on the potential good qualities that the right kind of settlers might bring to Texas when he said this: suppose that 400 or 500 Southern men of talents and capital and high character were to immigrate to Texas in a body next fall. What can prevent their future prosperity? But do not misunderstand me as to the kind of immigrants. Ardent, inexperienced, hot-headed youths piping from college. Does it sound like any famous Texans we know? Let's see, Fannin, Travis. Or ignorant, self-willed, mobbish mountaineers and frontiersmen who hold a lynch law and who damn those who are in office merely because they are in office, would totally ruin us forever. We need that class of immigrants who deserve the appellation of Southern gentlemen. I would fearlessly pledge my head that an immigration of 400 such men next fall to Texas would permanently ensure the prosperity of this country and the happiness of its inhabitants. Austin's problem, of course, and again, that quote's from 1829. Austin's problem is that description of these Southern gentlemen of talents and breeding and so forth became arguably less of the population as a percentage of the total in the years after 1830 rather than a greater percentage. The character, in other words, of the Anglo-Texas population began to change over time. As immigration increased, as the economy became more diversified. And one manifestation of that changing nature was the dramatic increase in, sorry, Jeff, lawyers. And that was already becoming obvious in 1829 when Austin said this: as regards the lawyers who are causing all the disturbance in the country, I believe they are an evil, and a great one. But they are patronized and encouraged and paid by the people. A distiller of ardent spirit throws into the world a drug that entails disgrace and ruin and misery on thousands of innocent and helpless women and children, sinks many a worthy man from the highest to the most infamous grade of society. Is the distiller or those who support him most to blame? So he let the lawyers off the hook a little bit. The truth is, Austin said, the evil lies in the people themselves. It is part of the national character of Americans to be contentious and litigious. And I do believe that a lawyer would fatten on 100 Americans when he would starve on 10,000 of any other people on earth. And he went on to support arbitration as a better way to settle differences. Need I mention the list of non-farmers, of lawyers, doctors, editors, professional politicians, soldiers, who comprised the ranks of the war party and who were among the leading agitators for war in the years after 1830. William Barrett Travis, lawyer. William H. Wharton, lawyer. John Wharton, lawyer and doctor, lawyer and editor. Robert Williamson, lawyer and editor. Sam Houston, lawyer, politician, soldier. Branch Archer, medical doctor. James Fannin, slave trader. Jim Bowie, swindler, forger, slave smuggler, land speculator. And it's worth noting that not all the ones I mentioned, but many of them were fairly recent arrivals to Texas when the revolution breaks out in 1835. Historian Paul Lack, in his book, The Texas Revolutionary Experience, noted that the old settlers, and we're defining old settlers as those who came to Texas, got land grants in Austin's and other colonies, settled down to farm prior to 1830, differed from the more recent arrivals, statistically, in their relative reluctance to support the revolutionary movement, and also in their relative reluctance to serve in the Texas military once the revolution began. And none of this takes into account, of course, and this is a great topic for some enterprising historian, the large but still, I think, mostly unknown number of Anglo-Americans who entered Texas illegally, especially after 1830, and settled there. Stephen F. Austin, again, who was himself a latecomer to the ranks of the revolutionaries in 1835, encouraged that influx of illegal immigrants when he said this: a great immigration, he's writing this back to friends in the United States in 1835, right before the revolution actually starts. A great immigration, each man with his rifle or musket, would be of great use to us, very great indeed. I wish a great immigration this fall and winter from Kentucky, Tennessee, everywhere, passports or no passports, anyhow. And of course, he largely got that. And finally, of course, there's also the matter of the large numbers of men who came with their rifles and muskets once the fighting actually began. Remember all of those organized military companies who show up at the Alamo and Goliad and so forth, from places like New Orleans and Mobile and Georgia and such. And also those individuals who came alone or in small groups to get in on the fighting. Davy Crockett and his Tennesseans, among others. Paul Lack, in his book, found, and he did a very close statistical study of the membership of all the Texas Revolutionary armies, and he found that fully 40% of the men fighting for Texas in the Revolution had arrived in Texas after October 1st, 1835, after the fighting begins. And that's a very revealing figure. As we're reminded by Santa Anna's character in the new Alamo movie, those you've seen it, these men really were, these men who arrived after the fighting began, who arrived strictly to fight, apart, we could argue, the debates of their cause, the merits of their cause, but strictly from a standpoint of sort of international law, these men really were little more than mercenaries or soldiers of fortune, or as Santa Anna called them, pirates. So let me pause here and see if I can make some sense out of all this by summarizing what I've said up to this point. So we've got this fiercely independent population of Anglo-American immigrants, these good Jacksonian Americans, who think and talk and act like good Jacksonian Americans, even though they've left Jacksonian America behind. And they're going to continue to think and talk and act like that, no matter what pledges they've made to Mexico. They are, for the most part, not assimilating. They are not learning Spanish and so forth. Exceptions to all these rules, of course, but statistically speaking. And while they all share the bedrock characteristics of Jacksonian Americans, there is a discernible shift in the character of the Anglo-Texas population in the years after 1830, due primarily to the difference between a landowning farming population and, on one hand, and a group of younger, more ambitious, more likely single men who are pursuing livelihoods other than farming. Men who therefore didn't really have as great a stake in society as some of the old settlers. It's also important to remember the effect that the overall numbers of Anglo settlers has. By 1835, they outnumber native Mexicans, Tejanos, at least by a ratio of 5 to 1, maybe a good bit more than that. And so the perceived need to accommodate the native Mexican population, in other words, the need to get along is no longer as acutely felt as it had been when they were the minority. So in conclusion, I guess I would say that we can look at the major political events. We can look at the law of April 6, 1830. We can look at the resistance to the enforcement of trade restrictions. We can look at the reaction to the placement of Mexican military garrisons in Texas. We can look at the refusal of Mexico to grant separate statehood to Texas. We can look at the imprisonment of Stephen F. Austin. We can look at Santa Anna's switch to centralism and his subsequent move to squash the opposition in Texas. And we can look at all these political and military events. But it's only when we take into account the character of the Anglo-Texans and these shifting social and economic factors, I think, that we can really get a more complete understanding of these well-known political and military events that lead to revolution. And with that, I'll turn the floor back over to Jim.
That little book that Gregg mentioned modestly is, of course, his magnificent Stephen F. Austin, Impresario of Texas, published in 1999 by the Yale University Press. Someone asked me today, politely, how the heck do you, and that's not the word he used, how the heck do you teach Texas history at North Carolina State University? And the answer is I teach courses in the antebellum South and the American West, but to my great joy, every 4, 5, 6 years, my colleagues and I each get to teach courses in our specialties. So this coming fall, I'll get to teach a semester-long course with 15 history majors on the history and historiography of the Texas Revolution. And some of my colleagues who know a lot more about that subject than I do don't get to teach courses like that. So I consider myself extremely lucky. When Gregg, and Gregg's book, of course, is one of the basics that I'm using for that course. When he published this book in 1999, it had been more than 70 years since a scholarly biography of Stephen F. Austin had appeared. And it didn't get easier as each decade passed to be the guy to follow Eugene C. Barker. It got harder. And Gregg stepped up to the plate and wrote a book which is a work of wisdom as well as a work of art. And it's just a magnificent one. When I first read Andres Tijerina's Tejanos in Texas under the Mexican flag, 1821 to 36, it was not exactly under the same title because I read it in the form of his dissertation at the University of Texas. And even in dissertation form, it curled my socks. It was one of the most original and innovative looks the Tejanos and Mexican Texas that I had ever seen. I learned a great deal about how the lives of those people formed some of the lasting institutions and ways of life of all of us who still live in Texas, and especially of the 19th century. That book and his later Tejano Empire, Life on the South Texas Ranchos, will educate any of you who will read those who have not done so already. Andres' next project is to take the artist from San Diego, Texas, Ricardo Beasley, who did these marvelous drawings of the lives and the work of the vaqueros of South Texas, to study Ricardo Beasley and to do a biography of him, and I look forward to it coming. Andres is going to talk to us about the coming of the Texas Revolution and the reasons for the Texas Revolution from another perspective. Shift over to Bexar County, take a nod at Nacogdoches and at Goliad and Victoria, and take a look at the Tejanos and how they saw the coming of the revolution. So please welcome Andres Tijerina.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you, San Jacinto Historical Advisory Board, Jeff Dunn. Thank you all the people who put this together, and for inviting me, Loretta Williams, for inviting me, making me feel very welcome in Houston. I'd like to talk to you today about the Tejano side of the Texas Revolution. That's a very corny title, but I stole it from a distinguished historian and professor of the University of Texas, Dr. Carlos Castañeda, who founded probably the largest Latin American library in the world, except for the Library of Congress at the University of Texas, the Nettie Lee Benson Library. Castañeda wrote a book he called The Mexican Side of the Revolution, and I read it when I was in college, and I thought, who cares? I'm not a Mexican. If anything, I'd like to know, I thought, about the Mexican Americans, the citizens of Texas. What is their side? They played a role. And sure, for historical purposes, I wanted to know the Mexican side, but I thought Castañeda should have told us what the Tejanos did, because they're American citizens now. Their descendants are American citizens now. They were Tejanos, they were Texans, and I wanted to know what their side was, and I hadn't read it. So that's what you're going to hear. I'd like to identify some issues for you today on the Tejano role, but issues on history as discourse and the role of memory, the public memory, in defining history and our museums. I'd like to talk to you about the Tejano role in the Revolution, their role in history, in Texas history. And I'd like to talk to you about the formation of the Texas identity, the identity of who the Texan is. How did that come about? The Tejano. Very quickly, I'm going to give you a sort of a pat lecture that I give very frequently. It's the one that Jim referred to a while ago that I first thought, I think this is what people have to hear. Before I even get started, let me remind you that when the Anglo-American came to Texas, Texas had a very distinctive culture. These Tejanos thought they were better than other Mexicans. They had lived out on the frontera, the northern edge of Mexico, ever since it was Spain. And they had brought European civilization here, and they had established towns and cities and government and land titles. They had tried to bring justice and democracy. They tried to bring stability to this area. And they fought hostile American Indian tribes. They fought gangsters and cattle rustlers, and they were proud of themselves. So when the Anglo-American arrived here, the ones that We just heard Gregg talk about, Dr. Cantrell speak about the Anglo-American with Stephen F. Austin. They literally wore buckskin. They wore moccasins. They were farmers. These people had, in the words of Randolph Campbell, they had gone to Texas. They had left Tennessee. They were broke, many of them. But 30 years later, that Anglo-American frontier is no longer wearing moccasins and coonskin caps and buckskin and planting tobacco and corn. 30 years later, by 1850, the Anglo-American is wearing Mexican botas. He's not wearing coonskin, he's wearing a sombrero, because in Texas, you put something on your head, it's hot. They weren't so much farmers. Sure, they were farmers, but they learned to ride horses here in Texas. Mesteños. Jack Jackson, the authority on this subject, wrote like a dictionary. This book is so thick with documents on how the Tejanos had brought the ranching industry to Texas and shared it with the Anglo-American. Look, you don't wear moccasins on a horse. Put some boots on. Use a saddle. Here's the way you ride. Here's the way you make a rope. Here's the way you throw a rope. And that's the animal you throw it at. Longhorn cattle. That's where the cattle came from. That's where the longhorn. Tejanos not only gave them this culture, the clothing, the words, the skills, but they gave them the laws. They said, look, not 40 acres. 40 acres is Anglo-Saxon law. Here we're looking at 4,000 acres minimum. And when you get it, it's a homestead. That means it can't be taken from you just because you're in debt. And we want you people to come here to Texas. That's why the Anglo-Americans came. They were welcomed with 4,000 acres minimum, free. That's not an Anglo-Saxon principle. Anglo-Saxons sell land, or you buy it at auction. These people granted it with protection. So it's their land laws, it's their water laws, it's their family laws, little things like that we never think about that these people developed. The principle of adopting a child into a family, that law was written here by the Tejanos here in Texas. So the Anglo-Americans didn't just learn how to eat barbecue. They didn't just learn how to ride a horse. They also learned, hey, when you adopt a child, you can do it legally. They learned the principle of adoption, of a man and a woman actually sharing one in the finances of the family. Community property laws, they're Tejano laws written here in Texas. Many education laws. So let's understand that when we're talking about Tejanos, we're not talking about Mexicans, we're not talking about foreigners, we're talking about the culture that you live and enjoy today. We're talking about the enchiladas you eat every Wednesday. And it's not a frightening thing to become Mexican. You know, you put your boots on, put a hat on, learn to use a rope, say lasso instead of rope, say corral instead of stockade. You eat guacamole instead of corn pone. It's not bad. That's what these people were doing. They were becoming Mexican, just like the Anglo-American used to be English, and on the northeastern frontier, there in Plymouth Rock, they became Americans. So did they here in Texas become Tejanos. They became Texans, and now they were proud, and they thought they were better than other Americans. Hey, Texas brag was in Texas Spanish first. And they call themselves Tejanos. Tejano means Texan. They're the first ones to call themselves Texans. They just said it in Spanish, Tejano. So I always say, you know, I'm very glad to acknowledge my forefathers, Jefferson and Washington. I always thought there's never Tijerina there. But I'm willing to acknowledge that, by gosh, we got the Constitution from our forefathers, Jefferson and Hamilton, etc. But I always remind my fellow Texans, don't forget to thank your Tejano forefathers every time you get in a car you call a Bronco or a Maverick or a Pinto, and you go down a street you call Alameda, and you go to a place, you cross a river called the San Jacinto, the Colorado, the Brazos, and you go to a place called a Rancho, and you sit on a patio and you eat barbecue. Don't forget your Tejano forefathers. And your Tejano culture, you enjoy it every day. So let's understand that. And identity as a Texan, it changes. Different people accept it. You became Tejanos. Other people become Texans. Culture is not, and identity as a Texan is not just for one people, and it just doesn't change. It's dynamic. And that's what I'd like to talk to you about today, that history, memory, and what we remember is dynamic. The museums, the monuments, they're dynamic, they change. The Tejano fought for independence. They planted a Republican government here in Texas. They sacrificed. They brought free enterprise. They sacrificed. After 1810, when they declared their independence against Spain, they were sick and tired of being a colony, and they fought until 1821, 11 years. And in that time, many of their towns, Goliad, Victoria, San Antonio, Béjar, were depopulated, partly because Tejanos had to flee. You talk about the runaway scrape. What about 3,000 Spanish soldiers coming into San Antonio in 1813? Anybody heard of that? These people sacrificed. Look, we know that George Washington lost half his army in the American Revolution after 1776. Did you know that Tejanos lost half of their population in their fight for independence? So they fought for independence, and by 1821, they were proud of it. The first Mexicans to celebrate the 16 de septiembre were the ones here in Texas. They started, and they're still celebrating the 16. Why? Because they fought for it. They sacrificed for it, for independence of Texas. They helped to found the Constitution of 1824 of Mexico, and they were proud of it. And they started celebrating in Béjar the 16th of September immediately. They are the ones who, along with a group of liberal federalists in Saltillo, after Texas was linked with Coahuila as a single state, began to establish a federalist republic here where the state owned its own public domain. And that, you know, is another thing that makes Texas absolutely different from all of those other states. Texas is the only state out of 50, thanks to the Tejanos, who insisted on this principle. We own our own land. Look, the national government, you can have this, you can have that, but you can't take our own public land. Texas still owns its own public land and its own public oil and its own public domain. The Viescas, a political faction down in Saltillo, helped the Tejanos establish and bring in, under their own legislative agenda, Anglo-American cotton farmers. That's what they wanted. They wanted technology, they wanted capitalism, and these Anglos know how to do it. So let's bring them in, give them 4,000 acres, give them protection of the Constitution, and they'll come. And they did. Gregg Cantrell will tell you about that. They poured in and outnumbered the Tejanos. All through the Texas Revolution then, Tejanos fought for and with, alongside the Anglo-Americans. Remember, the Anglo-Americans came because of the Tejanos. The Tejanos were the first ones to declare against Santa Anna. Long before the Anglo, they already were enemies of Santa Anna. They were just more indirect. They did not have the consultation of 1832, 33. They didn't do it openly like the Anglo-Americans did. Anglo-Americans, Gregg's already told you, very vocal. They had a very strong history of being vocal against England, against their own government. And that's what they were like in Texas. The Tejanos were not that vocal, but they did turn against Santa Anna in their own way, and they turned Santa Anna against them. In that way, I argue that the Anglo-Americans' identity was really being established long before 1830. Anglo-Americans invited the law of April 6, 1830. They provoked it. They asked for it because they were so recalcitrant. That's the way Americans are. I don't have to tell you. You're that way. I'm that way. That's the way we are. And that's their identity. They were preserving their identity as Americans here in Texas. But Tejanos were also defining their identity. Now they were no longer regular kowtow Mexicans. Yes, sir, Mr. Santa Anna. They identified themselves, we're Tejanos and we don't go along with you. So Tejanos also were defining their identity. It's because of the Tejanos that the law of April 6, 1830 was repealed. It's because of the Tejanos that English was established as a legal language in Texas, that Anglo-American settlers were allowed trial by jury, that they were allowed their own judges in their own municipalities. And it is a Tejano governor, Coahuil Tejano Jose Agustin Viesca, whose descendant, incidentally, lives here in Houston. Agustin Viesca, and I don't think he's here today. Agustin Viesca, the great-great-great-grandson of Agustin Viesca, the governor of Texas, lives here in Houston. He's an engineer. It was that governor, Viesca, who first issued the call, "Citizens of Texas, arise in arms or sleep forever. Thy dearest interest, thy liberty, thy properties, what's more, thy very existence depends on the deceitful capriciousness of thy most malevolent enemy." And he meant Santa Anna. When Santa Anna came to Texas, he was after Viesca, he was after the Tejanos, especially Seguin, Navarro, all these people who'd let the Anglo-Americans come in, who'd established a democratic government. Tejanos participated in all the battles. They were at the storming of Béjar. They were at Concepcion. They took San Antonio so that the Anglo-Americans could come into the Alamo. They were in the Alamo. They were in San Jacinto. Juan Seguin had a whole company of them. Salvador Flores had another company of them. Plácido Benavides had another company of them. They fought in the different battles. And they were not going to take a back seat to Anglo-Americans. Thank you very much. This is our fight. We started it. We're going to finish it. That was Seguin's statement to Houston. This is our fight. There were women in the Alamo, Tejanas, right there along with Susanna Dixon. You never heard of the Tejana women. For some reason or other, we call the Tejana women camp followers. The movies depict them as prostitutes. Now, Susanna Dickinson is gone through an apotheosis. She becomes an angel. There were Tejanas. Tejana took care of Jim Bowie until he died. So what I'd like to ask is for a reevaluation, not only of the Tejano role, but of the Texas Revolution in history and the public narrative. I think it has to be, when the museum people come this morning and tell us that there has to be a respect for the events, there has to be a respect for the events and the people who played it. There have to be changing priorities. This is what I mean when I say identity is dynamic. The priorities must change. And they have to be in keeping with the sensibilities that change as well. There has to be an inclusive interpretation that sees history for history's sake, not just history for the ones who have last names like ours. When you are talking about a battlefield of the Civil War, the American Civil War, you don't just say, and our Union soldiers died here. Hey, what about the Confederate soldiers? They're Americans too. You say what happened at the battle. They're all soldiers, and none of them want to be there. Many of them are crying. Many of them wish that they could just turn around and run away. And I've been asked, did Davy really die? Night before last, a gentleman asked me, as a historian, tell me, he says, did Davy really die? And he says, but doctor, before you do, don't hurt my feelings. He says, I'm serious. And the man was almost crying. He says, if you're going to hurt my feelings, don't tell me. Was he a hero? I said, Sir David Crockett was a hero because he knew he was going to die and he stayed. And he symbolized something. He represented something. He was a hero. And you don't have to embellish and tell me that he swung old Betsy and killed 20. Don't do that. Tell me what he really did. You want hero, you want drama, tell the truth. The Anglo identity certainly is defined My goodness gracious, a ragtag army of volunteers beats the hell out of Santa Ana and kills all his army and drives them off back to Mexico. That identity really is what the public loves, and that Anglo-American identity was taken and developed through museums, through reenactments, through old stories and recollections and reminiscences. We developed that one. But what about the Tejano identity? Did we develop that one? What about the Tejano sacrifice? 50% of their men, women, and children for independence in Texas. What about that independence in Texas? Unfortunately, we remember when we want to remember our own culture in positive terms, many times we either don't remember, we silence the others, or we simply exclude them from our beautiful memories that we have of our own people. Or sometimes we even demonize the others, and we make them in paintings look like gorillas, black skin that looks dirty. And ours we put a halo over, always wearing a white shirt. And the other guys are depicted coming up stabbing somebody from behind in a battle. Very often. And it's people like Holly Beecher Brer, anthropologist Richard Flores in his book Remembering the Alamo, Dr. James Crisp, a national authority on investigative history. You want to know why he can teach Texas history in North Carolina? Because when this boy talks history, people listen. He is a national authority in Texas history. And he can teach it anywhere. In Italy. True or not, Jim? He confesses. People like Dr. Crisp, people like Dr. Flores, people like Holly Beecher Brer are reminding us that there is a demonization process, and a lot of times it's reflective of economic changes that the nation goes through, that the state goes through. Jim, I have 1 o'clock. Is that about right?
Yeah, so it's
Okay.
2 o'clock now.
I'm sorry, 2 o'clock. Okay. And I have another 15 minutes.
Another 15,
Yeah, okay.
if you need it.
I'm just assuring I need it, Jim. I need 15 minutes. Texas was undergoing radical economic changes and transformation to industrialization in the period between 1880 and 1920, right after Spindletop. And you people should know about Spindletop and what the petroleum industry, petrochemical industry did too. This part of the world, Houston led the world in petrochemicals. But when it did that, it segmented labor. And much of the transformation, economic transformation, was impacted by not only immigration, but a wave of immigration from Mexico that actually frightened Anglo-Americans. Felt like they were being outnumbered by the Mexicans pouring into Houston and the Valley and San Antonio, outnumbering them in many counties in Texas. And that caused a racialization of labor. It's the Mexican cheap worker that they advertise. Come to Texas, you can get cheap Mexican labor, and we'll make sure that they're cheap. That racialization and the segmentation of labor, the transformation of the economic system, had a reflected impact also in history. Texas history began to change in that period, around 1900 and 1920. That's when you have these movies come out that depict the Alamo. In the movie that depicts the Alamo that came out in 1915, the 1915 movie, anybody ever seen that movie? It depicts Anglo-Americans in San Antonio killing Mexican Americans in San Antonio because the Mexican Americans were getting drunk in San Antonio and beating and trying to insult Anglo-American women. And so that's what the Alamo was all about in that movie. And Santa Ana comes up to help the Mexican Americans, and so the Anglos finally killed it. History underwent a change in that time period. And Jim Crisp, when he presented his paper in Italy, and when he talked to the rest of us historians and told us about, look at art, look how art, the McCardle paintings, the Onderdonk paintings, look how the picture of San Jacinto, look how the picture of the Alamo have changed. They're no longer one army fighting another. It's more like the Anglo-Texan heroes being slaughtered by guerrillas. Look at the paintings carefully sometime, and you see this demonization. The public memory then developed the Anglo-Texan identity. And it left us with a public discourse that the Texans had won Texas independence. And we celebrate then March 2nd, 1836 as Texas independence. That they brought liberty, they brought government, they brought democracy and a constitution to a heathen land. They brought Christianity. These are the people who brought modern government to Texas and died sacrificing for Texas. Unfortunately, the names that you hear, when you think of the word Texan conjures up names like Bowie, Crockett, Travis, Houston, but you don't hear names like Navarro, Seguin, Arciniega, Menchaca. And the Battle of San Jacinto is one of those. We tend to go through what anthropologists Flores and Brer tell us is a binary, a sort of a two-sided standard in history, that if they killed us, by gosh, that's a slaughter. And they massacred our boys at Goliad. Now, San Jacinto is a victory. 188 get slaughtered in the Alamo, 350 get massacred at Goliad, but 630 get defeated. How do you defeat 630 people who are begging for mercy, shot in the back, mired in the mud, up to their shoulders and shot in the head? How do you defeat that? That's not a slaughter. The men themselves said it was a slaughter. And yet we call it a victory, but we call the others a massacre. So when we depict history, if it's to be believed by our own people, we have to see it realistically. Sure, it's going to be gratifying, but I tell you, you do not have to embellish history of Texas to make it romantic, to make it dramatic. Tell the truth, tell it clean, and it'll come out more dramatic than any Alamo movie. We don't need the movies, thank you very much, to make Texas history dramatic. Jose Antonio Navarro in 1855 said that he felt that Tejanos were the legitimate heroes of the Texas independence movement. In 1855, he said this: Anglo-Americans, he said, are newcomers in the struggle for independence. Many of them, he said, have only been here a few months or years. And you heard your own Dr. Cantrell say that. He said, to complete the picture of their misfortune, the few descendants of Tejanos yet surviving in the city who have not yet been driven out or killed are disappearing. We're the victims of assassination inside of a people who claim to come as the blazon of justice and grandeur, and their independence is theirs par excellence. Navarro's own brother. Now, mind you, Navarro signed the Texas Declaration of Independence. He signed the Constitution. He helped write the Constitution of the Republic of Texas. He was a congressman. He was a legislator. He was a mayor. This man had to fight for himself because there had so many people trying to kill him, and they finally assassinated his brother. Juan Seguin had to leave San Antonio. Juan Seguin is you talk about Texans in battles. Juan Seguin that was in the Alamo in the siege and sent to try to bring the Texas Army to help. So as a result, when he was kept here by Houston, he was in the Battle of San Jacinto with his troop here in San Jacinto. How many Texans do you know who fought in both battles, Alamo and San Jacinto? You want a Texan? Juan Seguin. There's your Texan. But we don't call him a Texan. We call him a Mexican living in Texas. How do you come to a place and you're here 2 weeks and you become the native Texan? And those other people who've been here for 150 years are Mexicans, get off my land. How do you do that? Much of Texas history has been written and preserved by public memory rather than documented facts. For many years, it was even taught through comic books. In the schools, I had to read those textbooks. And they're not books, they were just comic books that depicted the Mexican. I'll never forget the line that says, well, the buzzards wouldn't eat the Mexicans after the Battle of San Jacinto because they had too many chili peppers in their belly. I had to explain to my 8th grade teacher, she asked me, she said, Andy, that was my name, not Andres, not the name after my uncle that my father had given me, but Andy. Tell us how come the Mexicans killed David Crockett. Me, I don't know. I wanted to wear a coonskin cap up until that point. After that, I just said, I don't think I want that coonskin cap. Now, this kind of history depicted the Mexican and made no distinction that there were Tejanos and there were Mexicans. Made no distinction at all. They're all bad because of their culture, because they don't know how to run a government. And it depicted this binary image of an Anglo-American as the paragon of virtue and democracy. They brought democracy. And they gave us independence. If it hadn't been for them, we wouldn't have had independence. Unfortunately, it served the purpose of Anglo-American gratification, but at the expense of other Texans. Women are Texans too. African Americans are Texans too. Tejanos were Texans in the 1700s. We're all Texans. We all have a history. This place didn't get beautiful just because of one culture, one people. It's beautiful because we have all of our different cultures. Because some brought the sense of constitution, some brought the culture, some brought the names. In fact, I've always said, really the most romantic, beautiful things about Texas, you know, the Longhorns and the Mustangs and the Boots and the Chaps and the Weber's Rancheros. And the beautiful names, Guadalupe and San Jacinto and all that. I've always said the most beautiful thing about Texas is the Mexican heritage that it has. And I've always said, you know, I don't want to offend anybody, but I've always said if it wasn't for the Mexican heritage, Texas would be Ohio. Oklahoma. Our history has too often silenced real Texas heroes that can make Texas a much more beautiful place to live in and to remember and to commemorate when we do our reenactments, when we have our museums, when we tell our history. For too long, Texas history, even that taught in the books in school, has alienated many loyal Texans from the public discourse. Much of Texas history is accurately proud, but much of it is exclusive, even vindictive, of our own fellow Texans. And I say that the Texas public has to decide. Someday we have to decide. Someday we're going to have to decide, people, whether Texas history will include or will continue with so much comic book content in the history, such as a binary view that we have even today that excludes a major racial and cultural population in Texas, or whether we want it to accept a documented state history that commemorates all Texans and helps us to forge a unified community of Texas for the future, once and for all. Thank you.
Thank you, Andres. We're going to take a very brief intermission. Please be back in your seats by 2:30, before 2:30 if you possibly can. Hold on. I didn't say get up. I said be back in your seats by 2:30. Let me ask you to think about something. You know that Jack Jackson and John Wheat are going to talk about Almonte when we come back. There's something Almonte was thinking about all the time through 1834 and 1835 and 1836. He was thinking about that man in the White House. And so far, we've been looking at things purely through a Texas dimension. What did those colonists in Texas think? What were they like? What were the Tejanos like? What did they think? We're going to see afterwards. What about the Mexican government? What was Almonte's thinking process? What did Santa Anna think? But you know, it just might be that the person who is most responsible for the revolution taking the turn that it did was that guy who gave his name to Jacksonian Democrats. So think about that as you think back on what you've heard and as you hear about what Jack and John say in the afternoon, and think if that's a story we might need to pursue at another time. Okay, now you can get up. Please be back by 2:30.
Thanks.